So as Helena introduced, I'm Frances Gunn, and I'm going to talk to you for the next 10 minutes or so about the development of an electronic parish risk assessment tool. So Helena's absolutely right. I was really privileged to carry out some evaluations of last year's webinar, and the input and the feedback and the desire from people for more support around safeguarding risk assessment was phenomenal. There were two really strong themes which emerged from the evaluation of last year's webinar. The first was covered really nicely by Danny. It was about how do we more effectively engage and walk with people who have been impacted by abuse. And the second theme was more practical. How do we assess safeguarding risk? How can we make it work for us in our parishes, in our religious congregations and in our life? So I suppose it's useful to reflect back and to consider what is In God's Image asking us to do in terms of safeguarding risk assessment. So it's really clear. Standard 1 of In God's Image is all about creating and maintaining safe church environments. So we all absolutely have to endeavour to ensure that all church environments are welcoming, nurturing and safe. Now, really specifically, In God's Image version 2 requires safeguarding risk assessments to be carried out annually on church premises and on activities involving children or vulnerable adults. So that's a really, really clear statement, and it's a requirement outlined within In God's Image version 2, which is our universal safeguarding instruction. So it defines a safeguarding risk assessment as procedures and processes to assess potential safeguarding risk in certain environments and activities, and crucially, to identify actions to mitigate these risks. So quite a big ask and quite a clear instruction. So I'm going to take a minute just to reflect back to one of the concepts which Father Zollner touched on in his input. He spoke about safeguarding fatigue. So there's lots of research around safeguarding fatigue from a professional perspective. So lots of research, lots of papers, lots of qualitative research done about how safeguarding fatigue impacts professionals, so social workers, children's service managers like myself, people working in the front line in safeguarding fatigue, absolutely. It's a difficult place to be, and burnout is really common. There isn't much research and there isn't much of a perspective on safeguarding fatigue in our volunteer community. And one of the things which the Social Care Institute of Excellence, who carried out our independent audits, they flagged up quite rightly that so much of our safeguarding process in the Catholic Church in Scotland is carried out by volunteers. So I suppose for me it's an interesting question. We're really conscious of how safeguarding fatigue affects professionals who are paid and well supported via supervision line management to carry out safeguarding. Do we know how this might affect our parish safeguarding coordinators, our volunteer community who effectively manage and run safeguarding in the Catholic Church? We don't, but it's a question, and it's an interesting question. And Skye did highlight that as a potential vulnerability. So I suppose for me, when volunteered to start this piece of work, that was my starting point, thinking who is going to be carrying out these safeguarding risk assessments and how can we make that better for them? So the first step within that was we created a short life working group to really explore this issue. So the first thing we did was a bit of a Scotland-wide scoping exercise to try and find out what's already happening across Scotland in terms of safeguarding risk assessments. And I suppose what I would expect one of the themes of today to be are these terms consistency and standardisation. And I suppose that's what we didn't see in terms of what was already happening in terms of practice around safeguarding risk assessments. Everywhere was doing really good pieces of work, very different pieces of work. But I suppose there were a few complicating factors that we identified. The first one of which was that we were coming at this in the pandemic, during the pandemic. So a lot of risk assessment at that point in our parish communities was very focused on COVID risk assessments. So it felt at points as though there was a real crossover between COVID risk assessment, health and safety, and safeguarding. And there seemed a bit of confusion and a definite overlap in terms of what we were assessing in terms of risk and why, and where does safeguarding fit within that. So the first thing really that we identified was that one consistent standard system to be implemented and rolled out across Scotland, across parishes, across dioceses and across religious organisations was our aspiration. So thinking back to what I spoke about before in terms of expertise associated with safeguarding risk assessment, I'm really conscious that in local authorities and health and social care partnerships and private enterprises, people are paid handsomely for their expertise around risk assessment and around safeguarding risk assessment. So I suppose my first question and my first thought was, how can I harness some of that? How can I bring that together so we can utilise that and learn from it and package it together in a way that's meaningful and can work for us in this setting? So I can see one of the members of the Short Life Working Group up here who brings an absolute ton of expertise around risk assessment. So really it was an excellent opportunity to bring together a small group of people who risk assessment really is, professional bread and butter, and to really start looking through the lens of what do we need as a church community. So the first hurdle which we came up against, and I know that there's been lots of discussion and debates around PVG processes and how the new Disclosure Scotland 2020 Act fits. So I suppose the first hurdle was about categorising activities. Are we talking regulated work with children, vulnerable adults? Are we talking non-regulated work and sort of non-church groups? So this is absolutely not the finished article, and I think that as we get clarity around safe recruitment processes and as we move on, tweaks will be needed here. But ultimately, where we hope to get to with this tool is that we type in the type of group and the activity, who the participants of this group are, and it will then guide you through a system of identifying risks associated with that particular activity. So bringing together the expertise within the Short Life Working Group, we identified several different broad categories of risk and just tried to channel that specifically to think about our church and our parish activities. So the first one is always going to be safe recruitment. There's always going to be a risk associated if safe recruitment processes and policies are not followed. The next risk thinks about supervision ratios. Sometimes they're applicable and sometimes they're not. And again, use of an electronic tool will almost skip past questions that are not relevant for a specific group and activity. Thinking specifically about safeguarding risk assessment, we must consider, is the dignity and privacy of participants? Are people going to be safe during this activity and on these premises? So again, the tool will just guide you through some checklists, some points to consider. Back to staff and volunteers round about appropriate levels of training. And IT is also a risk. Lots of risk associated with IT use, social media streaming. And the last risk is there any risk of harm and conflict with any external non-church groups who may be sharing and using the same premises? So these categories have been developed through lots of conversation, lots of discussion, lots of, I suppose, risk assessment, looking at what does the research tell us, what has a scoping exercise told us, and what has experience and practice told us, bringing it all together into these categories of risk. Now, I absolutely don't expect that these will be the final categories of risk, and I'll come to the next steps in this process just very shortly. But I think the beauty of this is that we have brought together lots of professional expertise to arrive at this. And the next step is we hope to roll this out for trialling in a few different settings. So during that process, we'll be harnessing your expertise, people who we are asking to complete safeguarding risk assessments. You can tell us how this works or how it doesn't, or how you think it could work or how you think it should work. And we will then tweak this and change it And the end goal is to arrive at a simple, straightforward electronic tool which can be consistently applied throughout Scotland, irrespective of your location or your activity. So just thinking about some of the practicalities, we are looking at an electronic system. We are using the same electronic system as is already in use for parish audits, because it's a system which should be familiar to most of us. It's reasonably easy to navigate, and it does translate reasonably well to paper copy, because we do appreciate that in some circumstances there are IT barriers and connectivity barriers, which are sometimes unfortunately non-negotiable. So we need an alternative. So the electronic system, as I say, will lead you quite simply through a process where you input some details about the activity, about the premises, about the participant. It will then trigger drop-down questions, which will then almost present you with a checklist of risks to consider, which you can mark off to say, done, happy with that, that's in place. It then leaves you with space to personalise it, because while standardisation and consistency are absolutely crucial, we absolutely acknowledge that what might work in a really urban, busy archdiocese might look completely different in a more rural, quiet diocese where activities look different and where the landscape and the context just looks slightly different. So there has to always be scope for individual input and individual mitigation of risk as well. And I believe that we've built that in quite effectively to the system. So our next steps, see, this is very much in its infancy. So we are at a point now where we have a version, which, like I say, absolutely isn't the finished article, but it's a good starting point. So we're at a point now where we hope to kickstart some trials. So as Helena said, my input with the churches in Galloway Diocese, so we're obviously earmarked for some trials. Katerina's very kindly agreed to roll this out in trial for the Archdiocese of Glasgow, and we've identified a few religious organisations and groups as well who are going to trial it as well. So I hope that from that, like I say, we'll harness your practical expertise in terms of what you need and how we can better make this work for you. We will then come together as a group and make some feedback and changes. We then hope to present this to the SCSSA with a view to, if the feedback is successful and if it's well received, to hopefully going live with this. Alongside that, we're also looking at development of training materials. Helena, in her role as head of training, we're looking at some short video clips and some flowchart type training materials as well, just to walk through the use of this. So they'll be developed and finalised based on the feedback and changes following the trials of the tool. So I suppose step 5, really, really clearly threaded throughout IGI version 2, is the need for ongoing evaluation and quality assurance. We absolutely have to be sure that what we are doing is quality assured, because that's the beauty of accountability and transparency. So I suppose the system that we're proposing here, when a PSC completes an online electronic parish safeguarding risk assessment, a copy of that will then be held by the PSC. A copy of it will also go centrally to the DSA or the identified safeguarding lead for the organisation. What that does is it allows 3 levels of quality assurance. So it allows the DSA or the safeguarding lead to have an oversight of what safeguarding risk assessments have been completed. It will allow for a bit of local thematic analysis of, is there any commonality in what we're seeing in risk assessment? Are there any clear themes which we need to consider? Also, what it does is it allows for some quantitative data to be brought by the DSA to local DRAMTs or risk management groups. So while DRAMT doesn't need to have an in-depth understanding of what risk assessments have been completed, certainly any themes or commonality that have been drawn from these findings will be really useful to be presented and considered by DRAMT in that forum. Also thinking about the establishment of the SCSSA, It then also allows that overarching level of evaluation and quality assurance. Having all of the safeguarding risk assessments held centrally in each organisation in one point allows really easily that external quality assurance, which is what we're moving towards in Scotland with the implementation of the new SCSSA.